Hi, it's Taylor T. Carlson, and I'm back with another video for you. Like so many of you around the world these days, I've been stuck indoors a lot, so I found myself killing a lot of time with movies. Of course, I've got a pretty extensive collection, and some of my favorite movies in said collection are the works of Studio Ghibli. This Japanese studio has been making movies since the mid-1980s. They've got over 20 films, and I believe over half of the highest-grossing films in the nation of Japan have come from this studio. There are some definite classic works here, maybe a few that are best left forgotten, but overall, Studio Ghibli has more hits than misses, and that's why on this video today, I'm going to rank the films of Studio Ghibli. For this list, I've narrowed the Studio Ghibli filmography down to 22 full-length films. I am not including short films here. I'm also not including any collaborations or any non-traditional efforts. I am including made-for-TV films if they are feature-length films, and I'm also including Nausicaa, which actually predates the studio. However, it did have a lot of the people who went on to start the studio a few years later. Without further ado, let's get started. At the absolute bottom of our list, at number 22, we have Ocean Waves. This movie was made on the cheap and quickly by a group of newer animators to Studio Ghibli, yet it still ended up going over budget and over schedule. This movie revolves around two young men who find themselves infatuated with a new female student at their school. However, she's very bossy, manipulative, and essentially has no redeeming qualities whatsoever. When the movie's all said and done, this female character has not changed at all. Isn't the whole purpose of a movie supposed to be that people grow and evolve and keep us interested? Ocean Waves doesn't do any of that, and by a pretty strong margin, it's the worst film in the Ghibli catalog. The one thing I'll say in this movie's defense is the animation is actually very good, and you cannot tell that it was made by an amateur crew, so giving them a little bit of credit there if nothing else. At number 21 on our list, we have Tales from Earthsea. This was the first movie directed by Goro Miyazaki, who of course is the son of Hayao Miyazaki, and this was much to the dismay of the woman who wrote the story on which this film was based, who pretty much renounced it when it finally came out. And I have to say, I do agree. The movie it doesn't really do all that much, and it drags on forever. A movie about swords, sorcery, knights, and medieval times, and dragons should be the stuff of epic. And this movie's just boring. I mean, we spend a lot of time hanging around a farmhouse with our characters doing manual labor in the fields. It just doesn't really do that much for me, and it's no surprise that a lot of people rank this one pretty low in their Ghibli lists. At number 20 on our list, we have Only Yesterday. This is one of Ghibli's many modern-day coming-of-age dramas, and it didn't get released in America until quite some time after its release. It goes back and forth between the present and past with a woman who looks back to her childhood. She's taken a break from work to go out to the country where she works with some farmers that she's friends with, and she flashes back to coming-of-age experiences when she was younger. This is not a bad film, but it does drag on a little, and there's a surprising amount of time spent on largely inconsequential events. There's a surprising amount of mentions of menstruation in this film, which is part of the reason Disney refused to release it back before G-Kids got the rights to most of the Ghibli catalog. I certainly don't dislike this movie, but if you're going to watch a Studio Ghibli movie, there are better choices than this. At number 19 on our list, we have From Up on Poppy Hill. This is another one of the coming-of-age stories. This one's being set in the 1960s, right before the Olympics that took place in Japan then. There are several minor subplots, including a group of students trying to fight to preserve an old building, and a young girl's first teenage romance. The big plot twist in this one revolves around incest of all things, unintentionally of course, but it's rather quickly and haphazardly resolved. Again, not a bad film, but Ghibli has better movies in their catalog than this. At number 18 we have Pom Poko. This is a lesser-known Ghibli film that revolves around shape-shifting raccoons who do what's necessary to save their land from urban development. The concept here is great. Preserving nature and fighting against urban development is a common theme in a lot of Ghibli's works, but ultimately this one does not justify the 2-hour runtime. There's a surprising amount of raccoon testicle jokes, and these get old very quickly. The style of humor Again, it outstays its welcome, and there's just way too many characters, and a lot of them are one-dimensional and interchangeable. I won't deny that this one does have its charms, though. At number 17, we have The Cat Returns. This is sort of a loose spin-off of Whisper of the Heart, dealing with one of its side fantasy characters. This movie's only 70-something minutes, and it breezes by pretty quickly. It's a fun fantasy adventure story. I wouldn't say there's anything great about it, but it's certainly not terrible. Not the best thing they've produced, not the worst. It's worth watching at least once. At number 16, we have Whisper of the Heart. This is a young girl's coming-of-age story, one of the many in the Ghibli catalog. These aren't exactly my favorite movies they've put out, but most of the movies they have, something in them works to some extent. And of the modern coming-of-age stories that don't have a whole lot of fantasy elements, this probably is the best one. And there were some light fantasy elements later on, but overall, it's a pretty basic, dramatic story. It is what it is. Again, not the best, not the worst, but the good does outweigh the bad here. At number 15, we have Ponyo. This, again, is a lighter, funner, more G-rated fantasy work. There's some light fantasy elements at play, and I do like the concept here. This would have been a great movie if it ran about 70 minutes, but at 100 minutes, it's just too long, and the length doesn't justify the concept. That said, you absolutely will fall in love with the title character, who's a lot of fun, and she's a character I wouldn't mind visiting again at least once. At number 14, we have The Tale of Princess Kaguya. This is based on a classic Japanese folk tale, and the style of animation here doesn't really look like anything else Studio Ghibli has ever made. It's a great, brilliant retelling of the story, but it's the absolute longest movie the studio has ever made, and you just get the impression it really didn't need to be. That said, you will love the stunning visuals here, and despite the long runtime and questionable pacing, it is one I am going to find myself going back to on more than one occasion. At number 13, we have My Neighbors, the Yamadas. This one was very lesser known in America, as it didn't get released until a lot of later movies, but I think it might be the most relatable movie in Ghibli's catalog, regardless of where you live in the world. It deals with the day-to-day adventures of an everyday modern family and the things they have to deal with. I guarantee you this one will hit close to home in at least one respect. There's a lot to love about this movie, and while it definitely falls short of some of the studio's masterworks, it's entertaining and it's certainly a lot of fun. At number 12, we have Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. This movie technically predates Studio Ghibli, but it's all the people who went on to start the studio, including Hayao Miyazaki and the rest of his comrades in animation. The movie revolves around a post-apocalyptic world and a young princess who's very brave and does what's necessary to protect her people and nature as well. Again, I love a lot of things about this movie. You can tell it's a little rough and dated. The synth-heavy 80s score definitely dates the film a little more than some, but I absolutely love the title character in this movie, and there are some great sequences. It gets a little bogged down in wars between kingdoms, which are a common trope in a lot of fantasy stories, but again, it's another instance where the good outweighs the bad, and I think this one definitely deserves a second look. At number 11 on our list, we have Porco Rosso. This is one of the least talked about movies in the Ghibli canon, and for the life of me, I can't see why, because I love this film. It's about a man who was transformed into a pig for his cowardice in the past. He's a pilot, and he goes around doing battle with pirates, bounty hunters, ace pilots, and it's an interesting look at a bygone era, and don't let the fact that the main character is a pig throw you off. It's actually a lot more entertaining than meets the eye. The midsection does tend to drag a little, but the aerial action sequences are some of my favorite moments in any Ghibli film. Don't overlook this one. At number 10 on our list, we have Arrietty. This is a great film that revolves around an ill young man who's staying out in the country, and he discovers that there's a race of little people who live there. Not exactly the most original story, and in fact, this is based on some classic stories, but Ghibli puts their own twist on it. The title character is definitely one of the more interesting Ghibli heroines, and There's a lot of, great drama, and because of the small size of the central characters, you get a lot of really inventive action sequences, which turn even the most everyday of objects into objects of awe and wonder. You'll definitely like a lot of the stuff you see in this movie. Again, I can't quite put it up there on the upper tier of Ghibli's greatest films, but for the most part, I think people are going to be pretty satisfied with this one. At number 9 on our list, we have The Wind Rises. This revolves around the life and the eventual experiences of a fighter plane designer. Originally, he's attracted to the awe and wonder of the world of aviation, but eventually he sees the world go to war and his machines used for war, much to his dismay. The horrors of war are a pretty common theme in Ghibli's films, and this one's based loosely on a true story, although it does have a few of the obligatory fantasy elements you'd expect from their movies. It's one that I don't think it's talked about as much as a lot of their other movies, but the themes here are pretty deep, especially for an animated feature, and it's one you definitely should not overlook. At number 8 on our list, we have When Marnie Was There. As of 2020, this is Studio Ghibli's most recent film. It came out in 2014. A young girl who's been ill and depressed goes out to live in the country with some relatives, and she meets a mysterious young girl and learns about her family, but it quickly becomes clear things aren't exactly what they seem. This one combines the coming-of-age elements with a lot of earlier Ghibli films with some light fantasy elements, and it really is the best of both worlds, and this one I think is pretty underrated, and I'm putting it pretty high on the list, but I think it absolutely belongs there. The main character is relatable, and you'll definitely fall in love with her over the course of this film. At number 7 on our list, we have Princess Mononoke. The destruction of forests and the future of urban developments in those areas. Again, they're common themes in Ghibli movies, and even though this one's set in sort of a feudal Japanese era, I think it's the one that best covers this theme. The movie is absolutely brutal. It's one of Ghibli's most violent movies, if not the most violent. When we meet the title character, she's even got her face just completely covered in blood. It has a lot of violent moments, but it tells a gripping story despite this, and I think the warnings are certainly prevalent in the modern world as well. This movie actually got a lot of the publicity it deserved, and I'm definitely glad to see that it did. At number 6 on our list, we have Castle in the Sky. This was technically Studio Ghibli's first film, being released after Nausicaa, which predated the studio, and it revolves around 2 children, and they end up encountering pirates and a lot of greedy government individuals who are seeking for treasures in a hidden floating island in a lost city of an ancient civilization. These elements, you've probably seen them before in other movies, but rarely have I seen them together done so well. The characters are all a lot of fun, especially the elderly female mother leader of the pirates. In the dub, she's voiced by Cloris Leachman, and she's just an absolute riot throughout the movie. It's definitely not the best thing Studio Ghibli ever made. There were more complex, more interesting, more deep stories to come, but this was a damn good first effort. At number 5 on our list, we have My Neighbor Totoro. This is probably the most famous film Studio Ghibli ever made due to the sheer variety of places the Totoro characters have popped up. They even use Totoro as their studio mascot on their logo. It's a simple story about a family who's living out in the country, and the 2 young daughters go on adventures, and they meet these mysterious creatures while their mother is ailing in a hospital. It's a short, sweet, simple story. There's not a whole lot to this one, but there really doesn't have to be. It's a great work. It's definitely stood the test of time, and this is one you're going to find yourself going back to over and over again. It's great for young and old alike. Number 4 on our list, we have Spirited Away. This is probably the most critically acclaimed of all of Studio Ghibli's films, and while not my personal favorite, it's not hard to see why this one is so beloved. It revolves around a young girl who ends up whisked away to a mysterious world when her parents and her start exploring an abandoned amusement park, and she finds herself having to do what's necessary just to stay alive and keep her wits about her. She ends up making plenty of friends, but also encountering plenty of dangerous individuals as well. The surreal fantasy worlds explored here are some of the most interesting that Studio Ghibli ever made. I think there's been, a lot of critical, positive reception for this movie over the years, and it's really not hard to see why. At number 3 on our list, we have Howl's Moving Castle. The medieval fantasy environments are nothing new to the world of animation, and not even to the world of Studio Ghibli. But I think this is the one movie where they absolutely got everything right and hit it out of the park. It's a great story about a young girl who's cursed and becomes friends with a mysterious magician, and meanwhile there's a war raging, and it looks like the world's going to go to some tough times. There's a great central and supporting cast here. The visuals are some of the best of any Ghibli film. The titular castle, of course, being one of the best looking things that they've ever animated. I absolutely love this movie, and it's definitely one of my favorites that they've ever put out. At number 2 on our list, we have Kikis Delivery Service. This is another one which combines elements from the coming-of-age genre and the fantasy genre, revolving around a young witch who goes off to live in a town on her own and begins to use her powers to run a delivery service while meeting all kinds of interesting people around the town. There are some deep themes here, and one of the greatest casts of all. Gigi the cat is definitely one of the best supporting characters in any Ghibli film. In the American dub, he was actually voiced by Phil Hartman in a posthumously released performance. This is definitely a classic Studio Ghibli film, and I've only got one film on this list that I ranked higher. And number 1, at the absolute top of this list, I have Grave of the Fireflies. Anti-war films are nothing new. They existed long before Studio Ghibli did, and plenty of anti-war films pop up in their films, but this is a gritty, realistic look at what war does, not to soldiers, but to everyday citizens who are trying to scrape by, live their lives, do what's necessary with the bare minimum just to survive. It's very brutal, very heart-wrenching. It's unusually mature and adult for a cartoon. There are still some light fantasy elements and a few comedic moments here and there, but they revolve around people trying to find pleasures in the simple, joyous moments of life, and this movie certainly doesn't have a whole lot of those. It's a movie that will make you cry, and I mean that in the best of ways because it's so powerful and moving and does what no other piece of animation can. What is your favorite Studio Ghibli film? What's your least favorite? Do you agree with my list? Do you grossly disagree with my list? Subscribe to my channel and please like this video. Also, feel free to post your comments below. I'd love to hear what your picks are. This has been Taylor T. Carlson, and I will see you in my next video.